Adrienne Louise Washington had been a police officer for 28 years, which meant she had spent 28 years in the specific relationship with institutional authority that comes from being simultaneously a part of it and subject to it from understanding its mechanisms from the inside and understanding from the inside how and when those mechanisms failed. She had entered the city police department in 1997 as a patrol officer assigned to the 4th Precinct, which was a precinct that covered a district she had grown up in and known since childhood, known its corners and its shortcuts and its particular rhythm at 6 in the morning, when the overnight shift was releasing and the early morning foot traffic of people going to work was just beginning, and at 2 in the afternoon when the school traffic changed the character of the sidewalks, and at 11 at night when the specific quality of the city after dark required a different level of attention than the city in daylight. She had known this district as a child, and she had worked it as a patrol officer, and she had understood in her first years on the force that knowing a place the way she knew that district was not the same thing as knowing how to police it correctly, and that the gap between those two things was the space where professional development happened and had to happen and never fully stopped happening. She had been a patrol officer for 5 years. She had been a detective for 7 years, first in property crimes, then in homicide, where she had spent 5 years building the specific skills that homicide investigation required, the patience for evidence that revealed itself slowly, the ability to hold multiple contradictory theories simultaneously without committing to any of them before the evidence supported commitment, the capacity for the kind of extended attention that cases with no immediate leads required. She had made Detective of the Year in her 3rd year in homicide. She had been promoted to sergeant in her 12th year on the force, to lieutenant in her 15th, to captain in her 19th, and to deputy chief of investigations in her 24th. In her 25th year on the force, she had completed the law degree she had been pursuing part-time since year 12, because she had come to believe that a senior investigative officer who understood criminal procedure only from the investigative side was working with an incomplete map, and she had always preferred complete maps. She was 55 years old, and she was the deputy chief of investigations for the city police department, which was the rank that oversaw all of the department's investigative divisions: homicide, major crimes, financial crimes, organized crime, cold case, and which meant that the work she had done as a detective and as a sergeant and as a lieutenant and as a captain had given her the specific operational understanding of each of those divisions that was the prerequisite for overseeing them correctly. She had not been appointed to the position because she was the most senior officer in the building. She had been appointed because the chief had concluded after a 6-month review of the investigative divisions following a series of high-profile case management failures that what the divisions needed was not administrative reorganization, but investigative leadership. A person who had worked the cases and understood the cases and could look at a stalled investigation and identify, from experience, what the investigation needed. She was that person. She had been doing it for 4 years. The role was administrative in its function and investigative in its practice, which was the combination she had spent 24 years building toward without knowing that was what she was building toward. She attended the chief's morning briefings. She reviewed the division commander's weekly reports. She met with the supervising detectives in each division on a rotating schedule that moved through all 6 divisions over 6 weeks and then started again. She reviewed the caseload data across all divisions and looked for the patterns that the caseload data contained. The divisions that were resolving cases at a rate below their historical average, and the specific case types that were dragging the average. The investigators who had disproportionate caseloads that were affecting the quality of their work, the cold cases that had new evidence requiring re-examination. The active investigations that had stalled at the evidence processing stage and needed a different kind of attention than the investigating detectives were positioned to provide. She reviewed all of this, and she made recommendations, and she made some decisions directly, and she oversaw the implementation of those decisions, and she documented what she did and why she did it and what the outcome was. She was good at her job. She had always been good at her job in each position she had held, because she had always understood that being good at any given position was the prerequisite for earning the next one, and that the way you earn a position in the city police department is by doing the current position at a standard that makes the case for the next one. She had known this at 26 as a patrol officer, and she had known it at 31 as a detective, and she had known it at 38 when she was promoted to sergeant, and she knew it now at 55 as deputy chief. And the knowing was no longer something she thought about because it was too far into her professional infrastructure to require conscious thought. She simply did the work correctly because the correct doing of the work was its own reason and its own reward and its own justification. She had been decorated 3 times for valor. She had been cited for investigative excellence twice by the state's Law Enforcement Association. She had led the task force in 2017 that had connected and solved a series of connected murders that had been investigated as separate incidents for 11 months before she had recognized the pattern that linked them. A pattern that had required her to read 900 pages of case files over 4 days, and to identify in those 900 pages a recurring behavioral signature that the individual case detectives had not been positioned to see because they had not seen all 9 cases together. The connection had broken the case. 4 detectives had received commendations for the subsequent investigative work. She had received the commendation for the pattern recognition, which was the thing she had done that the detectives could not have done for themselves. The task force had been the most sustained effort of her investigative career, which was not a casual claim given that her investigative career had included 11 years of casework in property and homicide. That she was proud of had included a number of cases that had tested her in ways that property and homicide cases test investigators who take them seriously had included failures and reconsiderations and moments of being wrong, and the specific discipline of recognizing you are wrong and correcting course before the error compounds. But the 2017 case had required everything. Every skill she had built in 20 years of investigative work, every pattern recognition capacity she had developed, every relationship she had in the department and in the prosecutor's office and in the neighboring counties whose jurisdiction 2 of the incidents had touched. She had worked it for 4 months. She had slept 4 to 5 hours a night for the last 6 weeks of the task force. She had been 47 years old and had understood in those 6 weeks both that she was capable of that level of sustained effort, and that she could not sustain it indefinitely, which was a knowledge that it was useful to have, and which she had used in her subsequent oversight of investigators, knowing from personal experience where the productive edge of sustained effort was, and what happened when investigators went past it and building into the division's case management protocols, the specific check-ins and rotations that gave investigators the recovery time they needed without sacrificing case momentum. She had thought during the 4 months of the task force relatively little about anything other than the 9 cases. She had thought about her daughter who had been 22 and in her first year of medical school and who had called on Sunday evenings throughout those 4 months, and who had understood from the way her mother answered the phone that the case was at a critical phase, and that the calls should be brief, and that they would have longer conversations when the case was closed. When the case was closed, they had talked for 3 hours. Renee had asked about every aspect of the investigation that Adrienne was able to share, which was most of it. She had listened with the focused attention of a first-year medical student who was used to listening to things that required the full use of her intelligence, and she had asked the questions she asked when she was genuinely interested, which were not the questions of someone performing interest, but of someone who actually wanted to understand the mechanism. Adrienne had answered every question she could. She had thought at the end of that 3-hour call that her daughter had the same quality of attention, that she herself had the quality that her father had had the quality that does not settle for the fact when the mechanism is available. She had been glad of it. She was still glad of it. She had also, in 28 years on the force, been stopped 7 times in circumstances that had nothing to do with anything she had done and everything to do with how she looked in a car or on a sidewalk or in a public space, stopped by officers who had not known she was a police officer, who had not known she was anything other than a black woman in a space that in their rapid assessment had triggered a protocol that the assessment did not warrant. She had documented each incident. She had filed formal complaints for 3 of them. She had received findings in 2 of those 3 that the stops had been without specific, articulable basis. She had continued to document. She had continued to work. She had understood 28 years ago and each year since that the documentation was its own form of professional practice, that the record was the answer to the argument that nothing had happened, and that the record needed to be accurate and complete and in the file, and that you built the record one incident at a time over the years, the same way you built a case, and that the case was always in progress. The first time had been when she was 28, 2 years on the force, driving home from the late shift in her own car in plain clothes. She had been stopped by an officer from a neighboring precinct who had run her plates and found nothing, and who had then asked her to step out of the car. She had said, "I am a city police department officer. I am off duty. I have my badge in the car." He had said, "Step out, please." She had stepped out. She had produced her badge. He had looked at it for a long time. He had returned her license and said she could go. He had not said anything else. She had driven home and had sat in her kitchen at 2 in the morning and had done what her father had taught her. Given the experience its due settled. The account moved. She had written the account in a notebook the following morning, date, time, location, the officer's badge number, which she had memorized from his uniform, the sequence of events, the specific words in the order they had been spoken. She had kept the notebook. She had added to it over the years. The 7th time had been last spring in the parking garage at the department's main building, where she had been a daily presence for 4 years. A new security contractor's officer had stopped her on the ramp and asked for her building credentials. She had shown her badge. He had asked for additional identification. She had shown her department ID, which had her photograph and her title and the department seal. He had said, "I'll need to verify that." She had said, "The phone number for the department's main desk is at the bottom of this ID. It has been there for 4 years." He had called. The desk had picked up and had said, "That is our Deputy Chief of Investigations. She parks on the 3rd level, you can let her through." He had let her through. She had parked. She had gone upstairs and had added the incident to the notebook before she opened her email. Then she had opened her email and done the rest of her day. She had never stopped being a police officer in any of the 7 incidents. She had never stopped being composed. She had never stopped documenting. She had understood from the first incident onward that the incidents were going to be part of the record of her professional life, whether she chose to make them part of the record or not, and that if she was going to have a record, she was going to have a complete one, and a complete record. Included the things the institution did correctly, and the things the institution did incorrectly in the same file, with the same precision, because the record was only as useful as it was complete. Her father had been a railroad worker for 31 years and had raised her with the specific combination of expectations that his own 31 years of working in a profession that had not always welcomed him had produced. You do the work correctly. You document what you do. You do not let the institution's failures become your own, and you do not mistake being treated incorrectly for having done something incorrect. These were not speeches he had given her. They were things she had absorbed from watching him prepare for work with the same care every morning, from watching him keep his own records of the jobs he had completed and the times he had completed them, and the supervisors who had reviewed his work, from watching him come home on the days when the institution had failed him and eat dinner and watch the news and go to bed and come back the next morning. He had retired at 63 with a full pension and a department commendation for safety record. He had been functional for 31 years. She had been watching him do it for 24 of those years and had understood from watching that functional was a practice and not a talent, and that you chose it every day, and that the choosing got easier but did not get automatic. His name was Walter Washington, and he had worked for the rail yard since he was 24 years old. He had started in maintenance, moved to operations, and spent the last 14 years of his career as a senior rail traffic coordinator, which was a position that required him to hold in his head the location, timing, and status of a large number of simultaneous moving elements, and to make correct decisions about how they should interact, a form of thinking that Adrienne had recognized in herself when she had spent 5 years in homicide as the same skill in a different setting. She had told him that once, when she was 38 and in her 3rd year as a detective. He had listened to her explanation and had said yes. That is what I do. He had then asked her 2 specific questions about a case she was working that she was not at liberty to fully discuss, but which he had correctly assessed as a connected events problem from her general description of it, which had told her that his ability to see pattern and movement had always been the core of what he did, and that the setting trains versus cases was genuinely secondary. He had died 4 years ago at 71. He had been a railroad worker, a husband, a father, a man who kept notebooks. He had never told her, "I am proud of you," which was not because he was not proud of her, but because he communicated pride the way he communicated everything of importance, not through declaration, but through the quality of his attention, through the specific way he listened, when she described something she had done, through the questions he asked, when she described a case or a promotion or a difficulty at the department. Questions that could only be formed by a person who had been paying very close attention to everything she had ever told him about her work, and who understood from that accumulated attention what she was dealing with. She had understood from the quality of that attention that he was proud, and the understanding had been more useful to her than the declaration would have been. After he died, she had put his habit of notebooks into her own life more deliberately than she had before, because the notebooks were a form of his continued company, and because the record he had modeled for her over 31 years was a legacy she could keep practicing. On a Tuesday in October, Adrienne left the department at 3 in the afternoon for a medical appointment, a routine annual cardiology follow-up, because she had a family history that required the annual follow-up, and she had kept the appointment every year since she was 42, without exception, because the evidence on family history and cardiovascular outcomes was clear, and she had always respected clear evidence. The appointment was at 3:30 at a clinic 12 blocks from the department. She drove herself in the dark green sedan she had driven for 4 years, wearing the civilian clothes she wore on days when her schedule included appointments outside the building. Dark jeans, a charcoal gray jacket, a canvas tote bag from the farmer's market she attended on Saturdays. The bag she had been using for the past 2 years, for everything from groceries to paperwork to the notebooks she carried everywhere, because she had learned decades ago that an insight not written down was an insight at risk. Her badge was inside the bag, clipped to the interior flap pocket. This was her standard practice when she was in civilian clothes off-duty, or on personal time the badge went into the interior flap, clipped visible, when the bag was open, not visible from the outside. Her service weapon was secured at home. She was off the administrative clock after 3 and was not carrying her weapon during off-duty personal appointments, which was her standard practice on cardiology follow-up days, when she was not on call, and she was not on call this Tuesday. The appointment lasted 40 minutes. The results were as they had been every year for 13 years, within the range that required monitoring, but not intervention. Her physician said same as last year, which is the result we want. She said same as last year. She thanked him. She went to her car. She drove to Palmetto Grocery, which was at the corner of Harwell and 14th Street, 8 blocks from the clinic, a large grocery store that she had been shopping at for 11 years since she had moved to the neighborhood. She needed eggs, coffee, and the specific brand of olive oil that she cooked with, and which this particular store carried and most others in the area did not. Palmetto Grocery at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon had the particular rhythm of a large grocery store in the middle of the post-school pre-dinner rush. Shopping carts, moving with the focused efficiency of people who have a specific list and limited time. The produce section crowded the checkout lines beginning to build. She knew the store the way she knew most places. She had been going to regularly for years, knew where things were, knew the general flow of traffic on a Tuesday, knew the faces of the regular staff and the faces of the regular customers. She had been coming here for 11 years. She was wearing civilian clothes, carrying a canvas tote bag, shopping for 3 items. She had stopped at Palmetto Grocery so many times over 11 years that the route through the store was one of the things her body knew without her mind's active participation. The basket from the rack at the entrance the right turn toward produce, the angle through the grocery aisle to coffee, the long aisle toward the back for eggs, the diagonal to checkout. The fluorescent light of the store was the specific fluorescent of a well-maintained grocery, the kind that is slightly cooler in tone than the fluorescent of offices, and that renders the colors of produce correctly, and makes the packaging on the shelves legible from a distance. The sound of the store was the particular composite of a grocery and its afternoon rush cart wheels on tile checkout lanes, beeping the ambient conversation of people in a public space that they are moving through, rather than occupying the refrigeration hum of the dairy section. She had been inside this composite of light and sound 11 years. She moved through it without thinking about it. She took a basket from the stack at the entrance. She went to the produce section first, which was not her destination, but was the direction her feet took her from habit, and which gave her a moment to orient to the store's Tuesday afternoon configuration before she moved toward the grocery section for the coffee and the back section for the eggs. She moved through the store with the purposeful efficiency of a person who shops the way she does everything else, with a clear objective and a direct path to it. Officer Travis Kemp was 27 years old and had been on the force for 3 years, assigned to the Westfield precinct, which covered the district in which Palmetto Grocery was located. He was in the store in response to a call from the store's security desk, a general notification that there had been a shoplifting incident in the store earlier in the day, and that officers should be alert to potential repeat activity. The call had been broadly worded and had not specified a suspect description. He had come into the store at 4:10, 5 minutes before Adrienne had arrived, and had positioned himself near the grocery aisle with the loose attention of someone who is watching for something without knowing what he is watching for. He was not a person who had examined his own patterns of attention. He was not a person who had been trained in 3 years on the force in a way that made those patterns visible to him as patterns rather than as instincts. He had instincts that he trusted the way you trust things that have not yet been tested in the specific way that would reveal their limitations. He had been on the force for 3 years and had made arrests, and had done his job, and had not yet been placed in a situation that required him to examine the gap between what his instincts told him and what the evidence actually showed. The situation in Palmetto Grocery was going to be that situation, though he did not know it yet. He saw Adrienne come into the store. He watched her take a basket. He watched her move toward the produce section. He made in the time between her entry and her movement into the produce section an assessment that was not grounded in anything she had done or anything specific about her behavior, but which produced in him nevertheless a focused attention that he did not examine for its origin. He followed her. He did not approach immediately. He maintained a distance of approximately 20 feet and watched her move through the produce section with the basket. She did not stop at any display. She did not handle merchandise without placing it in the basket. She moved through the section in the specific way of a person who is not looking for what the section has to offer. Because she already knows what the section has to offer, and what she wants from it is not in this section, she moved toward the grocery aisle. He moved toward the grocery aisle. She went directly to the coffee section, took the specific brand she wanted from the shelf, a 12-ounce bag of whole bean, the label she had been buying from this store for 3 years, placed it in the basket, and moved toward the far end of the store for the eggs. He followed. She took a carton of eggs from the refrigerated section, placed it in the basket. She then moved toward the checkout. He intercepted her between the eggs section and the checkout. He was in his patrol uniform, Westfield Precinct. He said, "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions." She looked at him. She assessed in the time it took to turn and look. She said, "About what?" He said, "We've had some reports of shoplifting in the store today. I'd like to check your bag." She said, "I have a basket with 3 items. You're welcome to count them." "I have not shoplifted anything." He said, "I'd still like to check the bag, ma'am." She said, "On what basis?" He said, "I'm conducting an investigation into shoplifting in this store. The bag is large enough to conceal merchandise." She said, "Officer, I am going to tell you who I am, and then I am going to continue to the checkout. I am Deputy Chief Adrienne Washington, City Police Department Investigations Division. If you believe you have a specific, articulable basis for asking to check my bag, I would like to hear it." He said, "I'm going to need to verify that." She said, "My badge is inside my bag. I'm going to show it to you." She reached into the bag and opened the interior flap pocket where the badge was clipped. The clip had caught on the edge of the pocket during the course of the afternoon. The bag had been in the car, and then on her shoulder, and the clip had worked itself sideways. She pulled the flap back, and the badge came with it, the clip releasing as the flap moved, and the badge came out of the bag into the open air of the grocery aisle. The gold shield of the City Police Department Deputy Chief's designation, her name on the plate below it, the department seal at the top. It was the size and the weight and the specific authority of an object that had been in her daily professional life for 4 years, and which had been in the professional life of everyone who had ever worked under her in those 4 years, and which was in the fluorescent light of the Palmetto Grocery aisle between the eggs section and the checkout lanes entirely unmistakable. She held it. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been a police officer for 28 years and who has seen this moment from both sides and who is fully composed because composed is the only register in which this moment makes sense. She was aware in that moment of the weight of the badge in her hand, the specific weight of a gold shield that she had carried for 4 years as deputy chief, and before that, in other versions, for the preceding 24 years. The weight that had been the same and different across the ranks as the shield's designation changed, and the weight of what it represented had accumulated. She had earned the deputy chief's shield the same way she had earned every shield before it, 1 year at a time, 1 case at a time, 1 correct decision at a time in the specific way that ranks in the city police department were earned, which was not by declaration but by record. The record of her record was 28 years long and was in the department's files and was available to anyone who needed to consult it and who was willing to look. She was standing in the egg aisle of a grocery store holding the evidence of 28 years in one hand and a basket with 3 items in the other. And she was composed, and the composition was not effortless, but it was complete. She said, "That is my badge, Deputy Chief Investigations Division, City Police Department. I have been a member of this department for 28 years. The store manager, Carolyn Park, was 3 feet away. She had come toward the aisle when she had seen the officer approach a customer because she had been managing Palmetto Grocery for 16 years, and she knew that officers approaching customers required managerial attention and that she was the manager, and the managerial attention was her function. She was 52 years old, and she had known Adrienne Washington by name for 8 of the 11 years Adrienne had been shopping here, had learned her name in the way that store managers learn the names of regular customers who are regular for long enough, which is through the normal accumulation of transactions and greetings over years. She said, "Adrienne." Adrienne looked at her. Carolyn said, "I'm sorry, is everything all right?" Adrienne said, "I'm not sure yet." She looked at Kemp. She said, "I'd like your badge number, please." He gave it to her. She noted it in the small notebook that was also in the tote bag, the notebook she carried everywhere, the current one being the 4th she had filled since switching to this size. The previous 3 in the cabinet in her home office where she kept the notebooks she had completed. She wrote the badge number. She wrote the date and the time, 4:17, she knew from the clock on the wall behind the checkout lanes. She wrote the location, Palmetto Grocery, Harwell, and 14th. She wrote, approached by uniformed officer, asked to search bag basis stated as shoplifting investigation. She wrote badge produced identified as Deputy Chief Investigations Division. She wrote it in the precise, economical language that 28 years of report writing had built into her, the language that put facts in order and did not editorialize because reports that editorialized became documents that lawyers challenged, and she had never seen a case benefit from challenged documentation. The language of the field report was a professional tool that she had been refining for 28 years, and which she used in the same way in the grocery store as she used it in the office. She noted the time with the care she had always used when noting times in notebooks. Time was the element that placed events in relation to each other, and the placement of events in relation to each other was the architecture of any account that was going to be useful as an account. In homicide, time of death had been the first fact and often the most contested. In the grocery store, time of approach and time of badge production and time of contact with Carolyn Park were the architecture of the account she was building. The notebook was not for her. She would remember this without the notebook, the way she remembered case details from 20 years ago that she had documented once and filed. The notebook was for the record, because the record needed a contemporaneous document, and a contemporaneous document written in the aisle at 4:17 was more authoritative than a recollection written at a desk at 5:45, even if the recollection was accurate. She knew this because she had built cases on this distinction, and because she had watched defense attorneys dismantle accounts that had not been documented contemporaneously. She was not going to give anyone the tools she had spent 28 years taking away from the other side. Officer Luis Salazar Kemp's partner on this shift had come into the store 3 minutes after Kemp and had positioned himself near the entrance per their informal division of area practice. He had watched from 30 feet the approach, the badge, the notebook. He had not said anything. He had seen what he had seen, and he had made a mental note of the sequence and the time because he had been on the force for 6 years and had developed in 6 years a specific attentiveness to situations that were going to require accurate recollection later. He had learned this attentiveness from a partner in his 3rd year, a detective named Okafor, who had told him the situations you most want to forget are the situations you most need to remember accurately. Salazar had not fully understood the instruction when Okafor gave it. He had come to understand it through 3 years of subsequent experience, through the cases in which his specific, accurate recollection of a detail had mattered, and the cases in which someone else's inaccurate recollection had created a problem that accurate recollection would have prevented. He understood it now. He watched the approach, the badge, the notebook, and he noted the sequence and the time and the badge number that Kemp had given the woman when she asked which he could read from 30 feet, and he held all of it in his memory with the care of a person who has learned that some things need to be held carefully from the moment they happen. He submitted a truthful witness statement to the Internal Affairs reviewing officer when she contacted him in the week following the complaint. The statement described the sequence of events as he had witnessed them from 30 feet, with the specific accuracy of a person who had been trained to hold details and who had held them. The statement noted the woman produced a credential within approximately 30 seconds of the officer's initial approach. The officer examined the credential and did not immediately accept it. The woman then provided verbal information that the officer did not immediately act on. The woman took out a notebook and wrote something in it. The reviewing officer received the statement. She noted in her files that the partner's account was consistent with the body camera footage in every material respect. Adrienne paid for her 3 items. She thanked Carolyn Park. She said to Kemp, "I'll be making a formal complaint this afternoon. You'll want to make sure your body camera report is complete and accurate." He said nothing. She was not looking for a response. The statement was information the same kind she had been providing since the moment of his approach, accurate and direct. Stated once. She put her eggs and coffee and olive oil in her canvas tote bag and walked out of the Palmetto Grocery into the October afternoon, where the light was the particular late afternoon quality of a Tuesday in October, slanted and specific and entirely clear. The badge was clipped back to the interior flap of the tote where it always was. She sat in her car for 4 minutes before she drove. She did not drive immediately after incidents like this, had learned early in her career that sitting for a few minutes was more useful than driving immediately, because the physiological response to what had just happened was real, and was real regardless of the professional practice that had managed it. And 4 minutes of sitting in the car was the form of acknowledgement she had found most useful. Her father had called it settling the account. He had meant give the experience its due, and then move. She sat. She breathed. She looked at the Palmetto Grocery storefront and at the parking lot and at the street, which was entirely ordinary at 4:21 on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and then she drove. In the first year of her career, she had not known how to settle the account. She had driven home directly and had carried the unacknowledged physiological response into the evening and had lain awake at 11:30 with the thing she had not acknowledged still running in her body. And she had understood lying awake at 11:30 that the unacknowledged thing was not going to be quieted by not acknowledging it, and that the choice between acknowledging it and not acknowledging it was not a choice between feeling it and not feeling it, but between feeling it at a time she chose and feeling it at a time it chose. She had learned to choose the time. 4 minutes in the car was the time she had settled on over many years of adjustment as the interval that was sufficient without being excessive long enough to allow the physiological response to peak and begin to subside, not so long that she was sitting in parking lots when she should be driving. She breathed. She looked at the ordinary street. She drove. She called Captain Darius Reeves from the car, which was the call she made first. Captain Reeves commanded the Westfield precinct, which was Kemp's precinct. She had promoted Reeves from detective to captain 3 years ago when the position opened because he had been in her assessment after a thorough review of the candidates the person whose investigative judgment and institutional steadiness made him the best fit. He was 44 years old. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "Darius, this is Adrienne. I need to report an incident involving one of your officers. His name is Kemp. Badge number follows." She read the badge number. She said, "I was shopping at Palmetto Grocery at Harwell and 14th this afternoon in civilian clothes. He approached me and asked to search my bag. He stated shoplifting as the basis. I identified myself verbally as Deputy Chief, and he said he needed to verify. When I produced my badge, he saw it and he had it. I'm filing a formal complaint this afternoon. I wanted you to have the information directly before you heard it through the formal channel." There was a pause. Reeves said, "Adrienne, I am sorry. I will pull his body camera immediately. I will talk to his partner. You will have my preliminary report by end of day tomorrow." She said, "I know you will. Thank you, Darius." She filed the formal complaint at her home desk at 5:45 before dinner, because the filing of formal complaints was time-sensitive in the same way that evidence collection was time-sensitive. The documentation was most accurate closest to the event, and the most accurate documentation was the most useful documentation. She wrote the full account in the order the events had occurred from her arrival in the parking lot to her departure. She included the time at each stage. She included Kemp's badge number, Kemp's exact words as she had written them in her notebook while they were occurring, the presence of Carolyn Park as witnessed the presence of Salazar. She included the location of the badge in her bag and the way it had come out. She included the fact that her basket had contained 3 items and that she had paid for all 3. She reviewed the complaint. It was complete. She submitted it to the department's Internal Affairs Division and simultaneously to the Civilian Oversight Board, because she had been filing complaints for 28 years. And she knew that simultaneous filing was more efficient than sequential, and that efficiency in the formal process served everyone involved, including the officer whose conduct was being reviewed. Because the review that happened quickly was the review that was most likely to be based on accurate recollection from all parties. Her attorney, a woman named Sandra Phillips, who had been practicing civil rights law for 22 years and who had represented Adrienne in 2 prior matters, and who was the attorney Adrienne called when she needed to translate a formal institutional process into clear-eyed assessment, received the complaint by email at 6:15. Sandra called at 6:40. She said, "This is clean and complete. I'll be watching the IAD process. Let me know if you need me to intervene at any point." Adrienne said, "I will." She said, "How was your cardiology appointment?" Sandra said, because she had known Adrienne for 9 years and knew about the annual appointment. Adrienne said, "Same as last year." Sandra said, "Good. That is the result we want." She called her daughter that evening after dinner because her daughter Renee was 26 and was a third-year medical resident in a city 6 hours away, and called her mother every Sunday, but also on irregular weeknights when she had something she needed to say. Adrienne called first this Tuesday evening, which was a departure from the pattern. Renee picked up on the second ring and said, "Mom, what happened?" Adrienne said something at the grocery store today. She told the account clearly in the order it had occurred, the same way she had told it in the formal complaint. Renee was quiet for the duration of the account. Then she said, "Are you all right?" Adrienne said yes. Renee said, "What did you say to him?" Adrienne said, "I told him who I was. I showed him the badge. I took the badge number." Renee was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Grandpa would have wanted to know the badge number too." Adrienne said yes. She said, "He would have written it in the notebook before he even said a word back." Renee laughed, which was a small laugh, the kind you produce when something is true and also painful and also exactly the right thing to say. She said, "Are you filing a complaint?" Adrienne said, "I already filed it, at 5:45. Renee said, "Of course you did." She said, "Call me when you know the outcome." Adrienne said she would. She said, "How was your day?" Renee said, "I intubated someone correctly for the first time without supervision." Adrienne said, "That is a good day." Renee said it is. They talked for 20 minutes about the intubation, and about the attending who had stood back and let Renee do it, and about the look on the attending's face when it had gone correctly. Adrienne knew that look. She had had it over the years when she had stood back and watched a detective she had trained do something correctly for the first time. She did not say this. She listened to her daughter describe it in the language of her own field, which was the language of the body and its mechanical requirements. And she thought that the look must be the same, the specific satisfaction of watching someone you trained do the thing correctly, which confirmed both the quality of the training and the quality of the person. She was proud of her daughter. She said so at the end of the call. Renee said, "Thanks, Mom." She said, "I love you." Adrienne said, "I love you too." She said, "Go to sleep. You're on the early shift tomorrow." Renee said, "I know. I know." They said goodbye. The internal affairs review of Officer Travis Kemp's conduct was completed over 4 weeks. The reviewing officer had Kemp's body camera footage, which had been secured within 3 hours of Adrienne's complaint by Captain Reeves, who had pulled it personally and submitted it to Internal Affairs with a cover memo that noted the time of the footage, the location, and the fact that the officer involved was assigned to his precinct and that he was cooperating fully with the review, and that his precinct's records of the shoplifting call would be made available to the reviewing officer. The body camera footage covered 6 minutes and 42 seconds from the moment of Kemp's approach to Adrienne in the aisle to his departure from the store. The reviewing officer watched it twice, the first time to establish the sequence, the second time to assess the specific moments of decision, the approach, the request to search the bag, the moment Adrienne identified herself verbally, and Kemp said he needed to verify the moment the badge appeared. The reviewing officer was a lieutenant named Chen with 12 years on the force and 4 years in internal affairs, and she had the specific combination of precision and institutional knowledge that internal affairs work required. She had reviewed body camera footage in hundreds of prior cases. She knew what she was looking for, and she knew how to look at footage without the narrative that had been provided by the officer's report, and without the narrative that had been provided by the complainant's account, because the footage was its own account, and it needed to be read on its own terms first. She watched the 6 minutes and 42 seconds. She identified in those 6 minutes and 42 seconds 8 specific moments of decision. She reviewed each moment against the department's protocols and against the training standards for officers in Kemp's years of experience. She documented her review of each moment. She was thorough, and she was specific, and she was fair. The reviewing officer noted the following in her formal finding: the approach was made without specific articulable suspicion. The general shoplifting call that had been the stated basis for the officer's presence in the store had not specified a suspect or a suspect profile, and the officer's body camera did not record any specific behavior by the subject prior to the approach that would have constituted a specific basis for the approach. The request to search the bag was not supported by specific articulable facts. The failure to immediately accept the verbal identification of a superior officer was a protocol violation. The failure to recognize a deputy chief's shield, an identification that is distinctive in design and unmistakable in presentation, reflected a deficit in basic credential recognition that mandatory retraining would address. She also noted in the supplementary observations section of the finding the complainant's behavior throughout the 6-minute 42-second encounter was consistent with cooperative conduct. She identified herself verbally on first request. She produced her credential without delay. She provided verification channels voluntarily. She did not raise her voice at any point in the encounter. She documented the badge number and time contemporaneously in a notebook, which the footage showed her doing while maintaining a calm demeanor. Her conduct throughout the encounter was exemplary. The finding was not in any respect about the complainant's conduct, which required no review, but the reviewing officer considered it appropriate to note the standard against which the officer's conduct was being measured. The finding: formal reprimand, mandatory retraining in credential recognition, and stop and frisk protocol documented in Kemp's personnel file. Captain Reeves sent Adrienne the finding personally via department email with a note that said, "I have read the finding in full, and I agree with its conclusions. I have spoken with Officer Kemp. He is aware of the seriousness of the finding and of my expectation that retraining will produce observable change in his conduct. I am sorry, Adrienne. This should not have happened in my precinct." She read the note. She thought about what she had felt in the grocery aisle, which was a specific thing she had felt before and which she knew had a name, and which she did not name in her internal accounting of it, because naming it in the moment she felt it was not useful, and she was a person who had trained herself over 28 years to defer naming things until they were in the file, which was when the naming became useful. What she had felt was now in the file. It had a name in the file. The file called it "Stop Without Articulable Basis." That was the name. That was what it was. She thought about her father, who had kept his own records for 31 years and had retired at 63 with a full pension and a commendation, who had told her, "You document it, because the document is the argument that cannot be dismissed." The document was now in 3 places: internal affairs, the Civilian Oversight Board, and her own files. The document was accurate and complete. The document said what happened. She thought about the 7 other times in 28 years, the 3 complaints she had filed, the 2 findings she had received, the 5 she had documented without filing, which she had kept in her files because the documentation of incidents without findings was its own form of record, not complete without the finding, but not nothing. They were in the cabinet in her home office in the folder she had been adding to for 28 years in the handwriting she had had at each age when the entries were made younger. In the early ones, the handwriting of a 29-year-old and a 34-year-old and a 38-year-old becoming over the years the writing she had now, which was specific and economical and did not waste space. She thought about Kemp. She thought about 27 years old and 3 years on the force, which was where she had been in year 3, which was 2000, which was a year in which she had made in her own assessment. When she looked back on it from the vantage of 28 years' experience, significant errors of judgment that she had not been fully aware of at the time, and which she had become aware of through the supervision and correction of senior officers who had told her specifically and directly what she had done and why it had been incorrect, and what she needed to do differently. She had been told, she had listened, she had changed. The supervision had been the mechanism of the change. The formal discipline in one case had been the mechanism. She did not resent the discipline. She understood it as the institutional tool it was. The thing she remembered most clearly from year 3 was a sergeant named Elise Montoya, who had pulled her aside after a stop Adrienne had made that Elise had seen from the street and who had said that stop was without basis. And I saw you make it, and I need you to understand why it was without basis, not just that it was. Adrienne had been 28 and had been defensive for approximately 30 seconds before understanding from Elise's precision and lack of anger that the precision was the point that a senior officer who took the time to explain specifically why something was wrong was doing her a professional service that was rarer and more valuable than the officer who simply said, "Stop doing that." She had listened. She had understood. She had applied the understanding to every stop she made in the following 25 years. She had Elise Montoya to thank for the specific quality of attention she brought to the question of articulable basis, which was an attention she had been applying long enough that it was now automatic, which meant she had become the kind of officer who could not in practice make the stop Kemp had made today, because the internal check was now built into the approach itself and not applied only after. She had tried in her supervision of the people who had come up under her to be what Elise had been specific, direct, without punitive heat, focused on the understanding rather than on the consequence. The consequence arrived through the institutional channels that existed for that purpose. The understanding arrived through the supervision, and the supervision was her role in the process, and she had tried to do it correctly. She hoped Kemp would listen. She thought he probably would. She thought Captain Reeves would make sure of it, because Darius Reeves was a captain who supervised the way he had been supervised with the specific directness that left no ambiguity about what the standard was and what falling short of it meant. She had promoted him because of that quality among others. She thought he would use it here. She went to Palmetto Grocery the following Tuesday. She arrived at 4:15, same as the week before. She took a basket at the entrance. She went through the store in the direction her feet took her, which was toward the produce section, and then toward the grocery aisle, and then toward the eggs. She did not see Kemp. She did not expect to see Kemp. She shopped for 20 minutes eggs, coffee, olive oil, also bread, and the specific yogurt that she ate for breakfast, and the 3 pieces of fruit that were on the edge of ripe, and which would be perfect by Friday. She went to the checkout. She paid. She put her items in the canvas tote bag. Carolyn Park was in the front of the store near the exit. She saw Adrienne and said, "Good to see you." Adrienne said, "Good to see you." Carolyn said, "How are you doing?" Adrienne said, "I am fine." She had been thinking on the drive to the store that she would tell Carolyn the formal finding when she saw her because Carolyn had been a witness, and witnesses deserved to know outcomes. She told her now briefly the officer received a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining. Carolyn said, "Good. That should happen." She said it with the specific directness of a person who has managed a public-facing business for 16 years and who has opinions about the appropriate conduct of the officers who come into her store, and who does not see any reason to soften those opinions. Adrienne said thank you for being there. Carolyn said you've been coming here for 11 years. Where else would I be? She drove home. She unpacked the groceries. She put the eggs in the refrigerator and the coffee in the cabinet where she kept the coffee and the olive oil in the cabinet where she kept the olive oil and the bread in the bread box and the yogurt in the refrigerator and the fruit in the bowl on the counter. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the bowl of fruit. She thought same as last year. She thought that is the result we want. She put the canvas tote bag on the hook by the door where it always went and went to her desk to do the work that was waiting, which was always waiting, which was the nature of the work and which she had been attending to for 28 years and which she was not finished with. She thought before she opened the case file that was the first item on her evening desk about the notebook. The notebook she had used to record Kemp's badge number and the time and the sequence in the aisle of Palmetto Grocery would go into the cabinet in her home office when it was full, alongside the notebooks that preceded it, alongside the folder that held the previous 7 incident accounts. The folder was thin. It had 7 items in it, 1 page or 2 pages each, depending on the complexity of the incident. The entries in her handwriting at the age she had been when she wrote them, 28 through 55. The folder was thin, but it was not empty. It existed. Its existence was the argument that her father had told her to make the argument of the record, which was the argument that cannot be dismissed, because dismissal requires erasing it, and you cannot erase a record that is complete and accurate, and in the file. You can only read it. You can only let it say what it says. She opened the case file. It was a stalled homicide investigation that had been on her desk for 4 days, a case from the Major Crimes Division that had stalled at the forensics stage, and that the lead detective had escalated to her with a request for a second review of the evidence sequencing. She had been planning to get to it this evening before the grocery store, and she was getting to it now. She read from the beginning, which was how she always read a case when she was coming to it fresh from the beginning, in the order the investigation had progressed, so that she understood not only what the evidence was, but how it had been gathered, and what the gathering had produced, and what the gaps in the gathering were. She read for an hour and a half. She identified 2 specific gaps and 1 sequencing error in the forensics that had produced the stall. She wrote her assessment in the department's secure case management system, addressed to the lead detective and the division commander. She dated it. She saved it. She closed the laptop at 9:15. She had been in the department for 28 years, and she was not finished. The notebook was in her bag. The fruit was in the bowl. The case file was in the system with her assessment attached. The formal finding was in the IAD file, and in her file, and in Kemp's file, and in the Civilian Oversight Board's records. Everything was where it needed to be. She thought once more about her father. He had told her in the year she was promoted to detective, the year she called him from the parking lot of the precinct at 8 in the morning to tell him the results of the promotion board. He had said, "You did the work, and the work made the argument." That is how it goes. Keep doing the work. She had kept doing the work. The work had continued to make the argument. The argument was 28 years long, and it was in the record, and the record said what it said. She went to bed. She was due at the department at 7:30 the next morning for the chief's briefing. The briefing would cover active investigations across the 6 divisions and 2 pending case reviews that she had flagged the prior week, and she would need to be fully present for all of it, which meant she needed to sleep, which meant the thing she had to do now was sleep. She set the alarm. She thought for one more moment about her father, about the way he had come home on the hard days and eaten dinner and watched the news and gone to bed and come back the next morning at the same time, in the same uniform with the same care. She had been watching that practice for 24 years before she had started her own version of it. She had been practicing her version for 28 years. She turned off the light. She slept without difficulty, which she had learned over 28 years. was the result of having done the work correctly and put it in the record and let the record speak. She slept. Subscribe our channel, we find the record, and we read what it says.